Here we are. Welcome to another Yarra Valley Writers Festival Sunday session. And we'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the many lands on which we meet. And on this weekend, when some of us might be getting the feeling that the world is slowly righting itself back to normal, we're going to unsettle you all over again with weaponized deep fake. Fake news is a phrase that we hear regularly these days, but what exactly is it? And how does technology assist those who wish to deceive us with what is real and what is not? To discuss our panel, about which there is nothing fake, co-authors of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's groundbreaking report on deepfakes, Hannah Smith and Katherine Mansted, chaired by Gai Brodtmann, former Shadow Assistant Minister for Cyber Security and Defence. Now, you're all very welcome to participate, and the way you do that is in our chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Gai, over to you.
Thanks very much, Michael, and thanks to you at the team at the Yarra Valley Writers Festival for hosting us today. And I too, on behalf of Hannah and Katherine, acknowledge the traditional owners on the lands on which we meet. It's a pleasure to be joining you all for today's discussion on weaponised deepfakes with the authors of a recent and widely acclaimed report, Hannah Smith and Katherine Mansted. Now, Hannah was a researcher with the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Centre and is on the eve of starting a new position in defence. And Katherine is a senior advisor for public policy at the Australian National University's National Security College. She's also a non-resident fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Centre for Science and International Affairs. So welcome, Hannah and Katherine. Thank you again, Michael, and the Yarra Valley Writers Festival team, and welcome to and hello to everyone who's tuned in today. Now, Hannah, first, if I could start with you, where is deepfake technology at, and what is the difference between deepfakes and cheap fakes?
Excellent, thanks, Gai. So this is a question that we both actually get quite a bit. What is a deepfake? Well, essentially a deepfake is a digital forgery that's created through this process called deep learning, which is a subset of artificial intelligence. So that's where the deep part of it comes from. And fake, it's fraudulent, so it's fake. Essentially, it can create entirely new forms of content, or it can manipulate existing digital content. So a real key advantage in actually using a digital forgery is that to some degree it automates the creation process. So it has the ability to be able to take the human out of the loop. It can create images of people that have never existed, rooms that have never existed. It can include videos, images, audio, sometimes even text. Now, what's really worrying about deepfakes is that it can be used to defame targets. It can impersonate people, blackmail elected officials. It can also be used in conjunction with cybercrime operations. Now, there are also some really good uses to deepfakes that we'll delve into a little bit later. But the other really important thing to note is that not all forgeries are deepfakes. In fact, some of the most successful ones that we're seeing are these things called cheap fakes. So these are forgeries that are created just by humans like me and you using software editing tools. So think Photoshop. These techniques can include things like speeding or slowing a piece of video, copying and pasting, or sometimes just recontextualizing an image to say something and feed into a larger narrative. This can allow for what we would classify as essentially just good enough content. It's enough to get it over the line and convince people without an expert audience looking at it, and people tend to just move on past that. Two really good examples that some of the audience will actually probably be familiar with is there was a video of the US House of Representatives Speaker Nancy Pelosi that actually went viral in May 2019. And this was a video that showed Nancy slurring her words during a news conference. And it looked as though she was possibly intoxicated or unwell. Now, in reality, this video was actually slowed to 75%. And then the pitch of her voice was just adjusted back to normal. So in November of 2018, there was another video that came out that made it look like CNN journalist Jim Acosta was actually acting aggressively towards a White House staff member. And this was spread by the far-right conspiracy website InfoWars. Now, in both of these cases, it was pretty obvious pretty quickly to most individuals viewing the videos that they were false. They were edited somehow. But it actually didn't matter because they still had impact. The Pelosi video, I mean, most of us have seen it, it went viral. And it was actually used by her political rivals to bolster this narrative that she was essentially unfit to serve as speaker. As for the Acosta video, that was actually a really interesting one. It was tweeted by the official account of the White House press secretary to justify the decision to essentially revoke his press pass. And the video remains posted to the account today. So what's really important to note is that what matters most is maybe not how good the fakes are, but the narrative, the context, and the audience that it can raise.
So where do deepfakes come into their own?
Where do deepfakes come into their own? Often there's this sort of obsession over this perfect deepfake that's going to fool even the most expert audience. But that's actually not where deepfakes have the most utility. Where their real strengths are is what I mentioned before, where they can take the human out of the loop. So when you can produce content at scale where there's this really high margin of acceptable error, that's where they're really, really good. Some of the most concerning examples that I've come across are actually text-based. This is because they're really hard to detect. So everyone expects on social media to have spelling errors in comments. Everyone expects there to be sort of strange in-jokes you don't quite get, or comments that don't quite fix the content. Well, that's where all of these things really play well into the deepfake production line. We've seen the impact that single tweets have had as rallying cries in recent months. So recent tweets from President Trump calling to liberate Michigan actually was met by widespread protesting of the COVID-19 lockdown measures across the US. So what does it mean if you can have one person who's essentially being able to falsely amplify content? You can essentially control social media movement. You can drown out content that you don't want to be seen, and you can hijack an election. If an individual can create enough posts that are all plausibly talking about an issue, they can use social media and search engine algorithms that function on basically like a trending topics to further promote their views. This is where they really start to come into their own.
So can you run us through the 7 different types of deepfakes that are outlined in your report?
Yeah, so essentially there are 4 categories that we've broken into 7 techniques that we have explored. So the 4 categories that I mentioned earlier are images, videos, audio, and text. And then they sort of range in complexity and polish. And the 7 techniques, which I must sort of add are definitely not exhaustive. As technology progresses, we will see more and more techniques come to the fore. But the first one we sort of look at is this thing called face swapping. So many of the listeners today will probably be familiar with there's apps on phones like FaceSwap or Zao that allow a user to insert the face or their face onto the target of another face. So quite simple, really, really accessible. Then you've got this thing called reenactment. So this is where you take the face from a target source and it's mapped onto a user. And this allows the faker to basically manipulate the target's facial movements. So this is used in things like videos. There's a really good piece by the Technical University of Michigan that actually had some pretty cool videos of how to animate different faces, and they went through different political leaders, including Vladimir Putin. Then you've got lip syncing. So now you want to add maybe some audio to that animated face. So users can copy mouth movements over from a target video. So this can be combined with audio generation and essentially allow the target to appear to say false content. Now, what happens if you want to animate the rest of the body as well? So there's this thing called motion transfer, where the body movements of an individual in a source video can be mapped across to a target in another recording. So the dance moves of Bruno Mars can be mapped across to myself. I definitely can't dance like Bruno Mars, but with the power of deepfakes, who knows, it could definitely be possible. Now we reach the last 3 techniques. And so far we've sort of covered off the manipulating of existing content. But then we get into this thing that deepfakes is really good at, which is creating new content. So audio generation is the first one. And this is where a user can take a small snippet of someone's voice, usually about 60 seconds long, and basically clone that voice. So you can create a small audio sample for an authentic voice. You also have image generation. where you can create entirely new images. These can be faces of people that have never existed, objects that have never existed, landscapes or rooms. One of my favorite ones that I've seen so far is fake Airbnb listings online, where it generates all the rooms and the text and the image of the host. And then finally, we have text generation. And this is one that I touched on briefly earlier, but this is essentially where one user can generate artificial text. And this includes things like short form comments on social media sites, but it can also go into longer form opinion articles.
Okay. So now to you, Katherine, are deepfakes a threat, and how can they be weaponised, and can they be used as a force for good, or are they just plain evil?
So I'd make a couple of points on that, Gai. The first is that what we're talking about here, deepfake technology, is only really new. So if you did a Google search for the term deepfake in 2017, you probably would have turned up not much at all. It's only been as a result of advances in artificial intelligence and the fact that more and more data is available, which is what that's the food that powers artificial intelligence, all of our consumer data. Those kind of trends and some breakthroughs in the science of deep learning have enabled deepfakes to become increasingly realistic and increasingly cheap to make. So we say in the report, democratized, in the sense that lots of different actors can now access this technology. It's possibly even already on your smartphone. So the first thing I'd say is when we're talking about the risks and also the benefits of deepfakes, we're only really early days. We're kind of looking down the next 6 months to a year or two to see where, once this technology becomes even more readily available and even better, where the benefits and the risks are going to fall. The second thing I'd say, given this is a writers group, to quote a little bit of Hamlet, which is there's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And often when it comes to technologies, be they deep fakes, the internet or whatever have you, often they're not inherently good or bad. It's the uses that we as humans put to them and the way we as humans build out those technologies that determine whether it's good or bad. So in the case of deep fakes, there's some really positive applications, from the kind of frivolous through to the really beneficial. So on the frivolous end of the scale, this is just letting entertainers and do what they've always do, which is kind of use advanced special effects. So there's proposals in Hollywood to bring James Dean back to life for one final movie, powered by deepfakes. There's also, of course, just with any type of content generating tool, there's valuable ways in which that is not just a Hollywood thing, but something that all of us can use for artistic expression and even political speech done the right way. On the perhaps more profound end of the scale, deep learning, which is the science that makes deep fakes possible, has already been used in a lot of really important healthcare. Sometimes deep learning can spot, anomalies in a scan that no doctor can, and it can pick out and say, look, this person might have cancer, have a look at this a little bit more closely, human. So there's some pretty important things there. Also, for those of us who are on COVID lockdown at the moment and may have been doing homeschooling, the ability to have real-time kind of a person or a computer speaking through a person who's able to interact one-on-one with people. It's pretty cool applications there potentially for tailored education for kids, and particularly for special needs kids, to actually scale up some personalised teaching. So they're all the good things, and so the technology exists. We've got to take the good and manage the bad. The bad, though, are kind of bad. And deepfakes can be used to amplify and exacerbate a number of threats that we've now been dealing with for most of the last kind of decade, really. So cyber attacks, for instance, one of the most popular ways to do a cyber attack is what's called a phishing campaign, where you impersonate an authorized user on a computer system to convince them, to trick them to give you their logon details so that you can do whatever nefarious thing you plan to do, like skim money from their bank account. There's already examples of deepfakes being used to do some pretty sophisticated phishing campaigns. Famously, a UK CEO was duped out of, or a UK company was duped out of money when a deepfake voice impersonator tool was used to impersonate the chief executive's voice in that instance. And then the big one that people talk about is the way in which deepfakes can be this, I guess, epistemic challenge, in the sense that they deprive us of the ability to know what in the public square is real and what isn't. What might be a conspiracy theory, what might be, quote, so-called fake news, what might be created by perhaps a foreign agent wanting to sow some chaos into a democracy, and what is an authentic and real opinion.
So it's a nice segue to ask you whether we are actually living in a post-truth world yet.
It's a fashionable declaration to make, but I don't think we are. In fact, I think over the last couple of months, Australia in particular has had something of what I would call a facts and an expertise revival with our response to COVID-19. So I think one of the main reasons why Australia had such a positive response and a high compliance rate with public health measures that were put in place was because of the way in which the government brought together not just the political kind of leaders, but also leveraged the expertise and credibility of the chief medical officer, for instance. And that's kind of borne out by the statistics. So the latest Nielsen soundings found that the demand for traditional news media over the last couple of months has gone sky high. So both The Guardian and The Australian more than doubled their readership. And The Guardian, which is traditionally kind of known as more, it's more of a serious newspaper in the sense that it's often struggled to get into the top 10 in terms of readership, has gone right up there in the top kind of 5, suggesting that there is an appetite for facts and expertise. So I don't think we live in a post-truth world, but I do think we live in what could be perhaps described as a constant contest of ideas and narratives, which is wider in scope and perhaps more fraught and faster than any of us have experienced before. And that's one, because of the technology which enables fake news, deep fakes, misinformation, disinformation to spread so quickly. 2, it's the fact that all of us are immersed now in this digital world. The internet is not something you kind of go on. It's now something all of us are in. And 3, it's that there are so many different actors, political actors, who are motivated to mess around in the public square. 4 categories that you could call these. There's the kind of the top kind of foreign agents trying to achieve geopolitical ends. Then there's just your ordinary political actors. Someone like Donald Trump comes to mind, who's very good at leveraging this grey space between truth and untruth to serve political ends. You've got financially motivated actors. Sometimes it pays to spread divisive material because you get more clicks on your site. And you've also got the extremists and the conspiracy theorists who spread the full panoply from right-wing extremists through to Islamic extremists that want to take advantage of fake news and poisonous and decent misinformation online. One other point I guess I'd say on that last category is that's where COVID has not gone so well for us. A recent poll found, for instance, that 1 in 8 Australians surveyed in that poll believed one of the more pernicious COVID-19 5G/Bill Gates conspiracies, this idea that, it's a pandemic and Bill Gates and his mates are hoping to get us all vaccinated and biometrically tagged as a result of spreading this disease, which is obviously rubbish, but is nonetheless gaining some traction. And the second one is just last weekend, actually, the Director General of the Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, gave rare public remarks in which he said there had been an observed uptick in extremist chatter around Australia in the last couple of months. 2 things I'd make on that. One, sometimes when we hear ASIO and we hear them talking about extremists, we think, oh, they're talking about kind of terrorism extremists. I would suggest not, because Mike Burgess, the Director General of ASIO, gave remarks earlier this year where he said his biggest concern right now is right-wing extremism. And the second thing to make on that is he attributed the uptick in the fact that more people are sitting around bored in front of their computers looking to make meaning out of what is pretty unprecedented times, and they're being attracted to some pretty pernicious ideologies. Now, where does this all play into deepfakes? Well, deepfakes are just another tool in the propagandist or the extremist toolkit that they can use to attract people to their cause, to confuse and mislead. So it doesn't completely change the game, but it gives the criminal just another kind of way to break into your house, as it were, another tool to engage in their nefarious deeds that we need to, as citizens and as lawmakers, policymakers, watch out for and figure out how we need to respond.
So, given those survey results and the Mike Burgess's recent comments, I mean, are deepfakes a threat to Australian democracy, and are we in an arms race?
So I'd say the answer is not yet. We haven't seen deepfakes being a big part of the extremist kind of discourse in Australia, or in terms of what we're seeing, dis and misinformation. But I'd say it's only a matter of time. And as these other things uptick, so too does the deepfake threat become real. And a couple of things about this. What makes deepfakes a little bit different to, let's call it ye olde fake news, which seems a bit weird because that's a term that's only been around until very recently. But one of the things is not just that there can be deepfakes, but that people can use claims that things are deepfakes for political gain. So imagine that the Australian government puts out, Scott Morrison on his Instagram, if he has an Instagram, I assume he does, puts out a video of himself doing X, Y, Z. If you wanted to contest that, you can come out and cry deepfake. And you can think of all different ways in which this could play out. Now, why that's concerning is not so much that ScoMo misses out on that one Instagram post. It's that we start to create this broader system where people don't know what to trust.
Yes.
And democracies are foundationally based on trust. Trust in our governments, but also trust in the institution of democracy itself, that if we don't like XYZ person or party, we can vote them out, and we trust that the election will be free and fair. And also trust in each other. Often one thing, because I come from the national security commentariat in Canberra, one of my bugbears is often when we talk about democracy, we talk about the institutions, the politicians, the bureaucrats, and we forget that actually one of the main parts of democracy is a mobilised civil society, is people who care and practice democracy daily. And so that social trust, that social capital between all of us, that's really important too. And if we get to a stage where we don't know what to believe anymore, or we feel like we can't believe or trust, that would be a dire circumstance, I would think, for democracy.
Now, just to everyone who's tuned in today, we are keen to get your questions, and Hannah and Catherine are keen to answer them. So please send them through on the chat box, and we look forward to receiving them. And if you don't want to be attributed, just let us know as well. Now, to Hannah and Catherine, you've made a number of recommendations in the report. So about how we respond to deepfake technology and weaponised deepfakes. Starting with you, Catherine, on the detection and authentication front and the elements in the report, can you just give us a bit more detail about what the recommendations you've made?
Sure. So the first thing to note is, when we're talking about detection, that's a technical process where a computer can call out another computer and say, you're using deepfake technology here, busted, that's a fake. The bad news is it's not clear that those who are developing the detection technologies are necessarily going to be able to keep pace with those who are developing the deepfake technologies. It's a bit easier at this point to build a deepfake, doing any of those kind of 9 things that Hannah spoke about, than it is for a computer to detect it. I should point out, when we're talking about computer-based detection, though, sometimes, something is completely outrageous, such as something that shows Donald Trump riding a rocket on a pony heading to the moon. Even if no computer can tell that that's not real, the context and perhaps some of whatever the political purposes are behind such a manufactured image might give us a hint that it's not real. So detection is important, and we say in the report that it's something that governments will need to invest time and effort in, particularly for, I don't think we're ever going to get to a stage where on social media it's going to be possible to kind of run an algorithm and we'll know whether everything is true or false. But you can think about certain kind of images or audiovisual materials or text-based artifacts where it will be really important to determine whether that is true or false. So the National Archives for Australia, for instance, Bit of a big interest there in determining what is and isn't an authentic artefact. Same with the judicial system and the parliament itself. So I think that's where, for those kind of most important national documents and documents related to the rule of law and due process, that's where I think we need to focus that detection technology emphasis. The next line of effort, though, is not in detection, but is in authentication, which is kind of the flip side of detection. So detection means that of a whole population of images, you can go through and figure out what's true or false. That's a huge task because it means you need to look at every possible image and make an assessment. Authentication just means that for certain particularly very important audiovisual or text-based materials, those particular important artifacts are able to demonstrate their legitimacy. So to make that a concrete thing, think about your birth certificate. When you go and show that to the DMV or whatever it's called in Australia, I've had a mind break, the place where you go when you want a license, you need to show them either an original, which has a seal or a watermark or something that's very difficult to forge, or perhaps you will have a certified copy that an independent third party, a JP, has signed. So all of those mechanisms that we're all very comfortable with using are a response to the invention of the photocopier, where suddenly it wasn't just governments that could print fancy things, any of us could. So governments and people had to come up with new norms and procedures so that the most important documents that really matter, that determine things, like birth certificates, can be authenticated. So in the report, we say that authentication is possibly more important than detection. You're never going to be able to detect everything anyway, and not every document is significant and important. So for those that we think really matter, think about ways to have whatever the equivalent is of a JP in the digital world. And there are a couple of already really good things out there in terms of what's called digital chains of custody, or digital watermarks, where you can trace an important artifact right from where it was created, who created it and when, and trace that through and authenticate it through time so you're confident it's a true and original copy.
And your thoughts, Hannah, on what policy and lawmakers and the broader community need to do on the behavioural front, because that's also one of the key recommendations in this report.
Sure. So no matter how tight you create a net with detection and authentication, examples are always going to slip through that net. So that's where really one of the baseline things you should be doing is help target harden society to recognize where something is coming from, what the context is, and what it's trying to mobilize you to do. So this is essentially things like education standards. Are there easy identifiable ways of helping people differentiate between a fake and not? An example that springs to mind is currency. So definitely not everybody who is watching this today is going to be an expert on currency and how to see frauds. But we have obviously polymer banknotes and different ways of the general public being able to discern whether something is real or fake, that are small flag indicators for us to be able to help pick up on without being an expert audience. So being able to teach people to critically engage with the content before sharing it on Facebook is also really important. So often there's quite a tendency for people to see quite inflammatory or emotive content, not even watch it all the way through to the end, maybe only watch the first, 10 or 20 seconds and then share it onto their friends because they want everyone to see this as well. Well, it's about getting people to slow down and be able to have a look at the content. Where is it coming from? Teaching people to consider the source and the context of what's going on. Obviously, as Katherine already said, there's only so many, ways that you can differentiate a deepfake from a real thing if you're looking at simple detection. So if you have, as Katherine said, an image of Donald Trump on a pony riding to the moon, the computer might say that, yes, it's correct, but obviously an individual who's seeing it sees it in context and says, hang on a second, this isn't right. We'll be able to get people to slow down and read context into that. Maybe on some of the ones that are a little bit more grey is definitely incredibly important. The other thing that we then start to get into is things like having trusted channels of communications. And this is, being able to have a place where the general public can gather information, especially from government, that it is already vetted to quite a high level. So you don't have deep fakes that are really entering into those communication channels. This is especially important during a crisis. So take, for example, something like the ABC coverage of the recent bushfires. Really important to have a trusted communication channel that doesn't have a lot of hearsay on it.
Mm-hmm.
Then you also look at the possibility of creating things like a legislative firebreak in communications surrounding elections. So like a media blackout, maybe 4 hours or 8 hours before an election, where there isn't time for the government to be able to correct false accusations. So I guess the final thing to sort of mention is that this content usually spreads because it's emotional and because it feeds into people's tendency to share this shocking content with others immediately. So really it's all about getting people to slow down the process of them seeing an image or video and actually processing it, and then what they do with that in the end.
Right, thanks, Hannah. Now we've got some terrific questions coming through already. I'll go to the first one from Brooke. It says, fake news, and this is to both you and Katherine. Fake news and COVID is extraordinary. Is there a pushback against deepfake now in arms of people don't care so much now? They've lost trust to such a degree, they've lost hope in believing the speakers and media.
That's a big question. People lost trust. I think the forgettery of the general public is an amazing thing. The ability of the general public to move on very quickly. We saw a couple of months ago in the US, there were protests over COVID lockdowns. Now there are protests over Black Lives Matters. So people move on quite quickly, and the ability of the general public to have their trust broken in one capacity can be devastating, but it doesn't mean that it can't be built back up. The same thing goes for if you have an amazing trust relationship between government and the general public, it can be really easy to break that as well. So you have to be able to maintain, clear lines of communication to communicate with the general public during things like COVID, onto Black Lives Matter, onto, lockdown measures or gun rights or anti-vax movements.
Katherine?
So 2 observations on that. The first is that this kind of, to bring it up to a meta observation, I think this points to something, because we're talking about something that is both a social problem and a national security problem here. And across deepfakes and a whole realm of areas that we now look at, I think that question and the discussion we're having points up that we often in Australian discourse and Western democracy discourse think that security is something that sits over here and it's something that kind of governments do behind closed doors, and that things like civil society, its robust functioning, trust in media, even a robust media are things that are in tension. Often you hear still politicians and bureaucrats talking about the trade-offs between openness and secrecy, between media and security. And what this technology, deepfakes, and the conversation we're having about the need for trust in order for us to push back against deepfakes shows is that they're not actually in opposition. They perhaps never have been, but more and more they're one of the same thing. So if we don't have a trusted media in Australia, if we don't have a free and fair and robustly functioning media in Australia, then perhaps we also will suffer in the security stakes as well, which is an interesting kind of blending of those things. The other thing to kind of point out is, I've lost my train of thought here. I've lost what the question was. Whether or not people are kind of like, oh, this is too hard and let's move on. So I think Australia's in a bit of a better position here than the US, which Hannah mentioned there before. So I think what we've seen in the US is essentially political candidates, and Donald Trump is a main kind of transgressor here, but it's not limited to him, kind of consuming the system in order to achieve their political aims rather than using and supporting that system. What I mean by that is it's in the political interests of people like Trump, and he's very adept at using this to create this doubt about what is true and what is not. Donald Trump is one of the biggest users of the term fake news in denouncing his political enemies. It's also, in America's case, it's not just a domestic problem. Of course, there's been widespread and systematic interference in America from Russia. I saw one of the questions there about, who are the people who are most likely to use this technology. And one of the main tactics of Russian fake news and disinformation is to try and make people doubt that such a thing as truth exists. And I think we have seen that exist in America, where it's not just deepened polarization, but it's just kind of a broad level of skepticism and distrust that anything is true anymore, and that expertise and authority don't really have the answers. I don't think in Australia we're in such a bad position. I think that when we see things like the 5G and the Bill Gates conspiracies bleeding into Australia, often they are trends overseas that kind of, because we have a global information system, bleed into Australia and affect us around the edges. But I don't think we have this broad and deep and irredeemable distrust for authority and institutions. We might get there, but I think to this point we haven't, and that's probably a big warning sign for our politicians and for our security apparatus, and also for civil society more generally. Don't do what the Americans have done, and make sure that we protect these institutions and trust in institutions, critically the media, as much as we can, so that we continue to keep our relative position ahead of the rest of the pack.
Okay, so there's a question here from Michael, and it sort of builds on what you've just we've been talking about. Is there an epicenter for deepfake? I mean, you've cited the US, you've cited Russia, China. You mentioned in the report. Is there an epicenter that specialises in this, or is it a universal activity?
I'll let Hannah jump in a moment, but there's two things there. I don't think there's an epicenter per se. I think different actors are very good at different of those types of deep fakes that Hannah mentioned. So in terms of, I think there's a good example about Russia in the report. I'll leave Hannah to speak to that one. On China though, there's some pretty concerning stuff actually, if you're looking at some of the national security chatter coming out of China, particularly around this text-based deep fakes. So even the most sophisticated kind of Russian disinformation campaign at the moment relies on humans. We might talk about bots and trolls, but ultimately it's humans sitting in pretty terrible conditions somewhere in St. Petersburg, humans who are, by the way, well trained in culture and language, their talents could be much better deployed elsewhere, who are driving these campaigns. But deepfake technology is now advancing to a point that it's possible to kind of set your objectives to a deepfake system, a computer, and then let it engage with people, which means you can dramatically ramp up the scale, how far it reaches, and how responsive it is, and how tailored it is to individuals. You don't have to have like a one-size-fits-all approach. And so just last year, two interesting blips on my radar coming out of China. The first was a government-funded research report in Beijing, which was a report ostensibly demonstrating how you could do automatic trolling. So the report set out how deepfake technology could be deployed to find a computer system that would read newspaper articles, distill the key points, this is all a computer, and then post comments to that news site, scientifically guaranteed to maximise outrage, division, and emotional responses. Now, it's pretty hard to me and to the broader community of researchers to see what good that particular piece of research could be serving. I'm not sure what good the world needs from automatic trolling. So that's one thing. We haven't seen that necessarily deployed yet, but the research is there and perhaps an intent to use it. The second thing is later in the year, a researcher in the US translated some comments coming out of the PLA's kind of cyber psychological warfare unit, which sits in the south of China and does a lot of activity in Taiwan to spread disinformation and chaos around Taiwanese politics. A paper there suggesting, well, hang on, this deepfake technology exists, and advocating let's put ourselves out of a job, psychological warfare officers, and replace ourselves with deepfake technology, which we think will enable us to achieve our objectives in Taiwan faster and cheaper. So those two things together, of course, that's just little pinpricks. And that's the whole thing here. Deepfakes are only new, and actors are only now catching up with what you can potentially do with them. But we need to look for those tea leaves, because once there's a change, it could come quite quickly, and we need to be prepared, and we need to have our institutions and our laws and our public awareness pre-primed so we don't get taken for a ride.
Hannah?
Yeah, so I mean, Catherine's covered off probably most of the points I bring up, but I will just draw attention to, I guess, two more things. And that's topic of Russia, which Katherine very kindly left to me. And one thing that Russia's really good at, and one of the sort of classic Russian propaganda techniques, is essentially to pump as much information and data into that information sphere as possible, that it's impossible to tell what is real and what's fake. You lose all grasp of what is reality. Now, this really plays into deepfakes, because you don't have to have this perfect example of a deepfake. You can have cheap and nasty and just pump out as much as possible, which is programmed by, one or two people sitting in St. Petersburg rather than whole troll farms. So it's incredibly economical to be able to drown out the content you don't want heard. The other thing that it's used for is, and this is something that, again, Katherine touched on already, is essentially is like a value add for techniques that are already used. So an example that we go into in the paper is this case of a woman called Katie Jones. And it is a LinkedIn profile that was created, suspected, it was possibly created by Russian intelligence agents. And on the profile, it had a deepfake image of a woman. It said that she worked for a very prominent security think tank. And then it looked like they were possibly using this profile to map security networks online. And LinkedIn is a really common source of being able to pump information, especially when it comes to intelligence work. Now, this was actually picked up not because of really robust detection techniques, but a really simple phone call to the organisation to ask if Katie Jones existed and worked for them, which she did.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I might just stay with you, Hannah. I've got a question from Kate. Can you list maybe 3 tips for the novice to identify deepfakes? Great question, Kate. Thanks for that.
Sure. So the first one, I would just say look at the context of what it is that you're seeing. As I mentioned before, it's, when it comes to sort of that behavior piece of the general public, it's really important to slow down and stop this thing called peripheral processing, which is essentially looking at, what the person's wearing, and thinking, oh, they look like they're, tidily dressed, I'll believe what they're saying. It's actually engaging with the content and saying, okay, what are they saying? Why are they saying it? And where's it coming from? So this is a media source that I would trust. Is the content that I'm receiving supposed to be emotive? Is it trying to get me to do something? And these are all really common techniques that you would use to try and work out whether something like a phishing email is real or not as well. So phishing emails typically will try and make you panic, or try and make you feel like you're missing out on a deal. There's a Nigerian prince that desperately wants to give me his fortune, but it's only there for a limited time. So it's designed to make you sort of panic and want to pass it on. Well, if you can slow down that process, that really helps. The other thing that I would say is, at the moment, we're kind of in this weird grey space where social media is starting to act, but really not quite there yet. So I would imagine that we would probably start to see things like accounts that are known for spreading disinformation will be banned or blocked or possibly flagged. So looking for those sorts of things, looking at the history of the account, what other things have they posted, as well as the context of the disinformation or information piece itself. And then finally, when it comes to videos or images, one of the, I guess, probably easy ways to tell if it's a deepfake is at the moment the technology isn't super perfect. So with images, you can usually look around the eyes and it doesn't do eyes particularly well. It doesn't do ears particularly well. It struggles with glasses. Now, those sorts of techniques will eventually sort of become a thing of the past, and they will become, more perfected and you won't be able to use them anymore. So that's when you sort of rely more on the context and what's happening with the accounts themselves.
Great. Got a good question here from Valerie. I might throw this one to you, Catherine. I subscribe to www.snopes.com and have been known to gently ask individuals to check content before sharing. But I feel like I'm harping. Do you have any gentler strategies to get people to be more discriminating with what they share? And Hannah, please, if you want to get involved in this response as well, please do. Who wants to take it first?
I feel like, Hannah, you're going to be better on this than I will be.
Hannah, over to you. Snopes.
Sure. Gentler. I must say, I'm a little bit harsh online. I think that, there's a certain capacity that I have for being gentle with people that are spreading disinformation, and it gets to a certain point where, I want to tell my uncle twice removed to stop spreading COVID disinformation online. I think that constantly keeping in check and calling to account is important, and keeping the pressure on. And, this doesn't have to be rude. It doesn't have to be, you're wrong, you should check your facts. Sometimes as simple as saying, hey, disinformation can be really hard to spot. Here's some sources that actually say the opposite of what you're posting. So being able to give them the tools to be able to differentiate on their own is really helpful. And then sometimes taking it maybe, into a more private chat room as well, rather than posting on, on blast all over the website can help sometimes.
I've got two things to add by way of a coda to that. The first is that, it's not just dummies that get stuck by disinformation. All of us are susceptible. We're human. All of us have those cognitive biases that make us, liable to be caught out. All of us have gaps in our knowledge. All of us are searching for meaning. And sometimes, conspiracy theories or whatever, because they give us like one simple explanation for something, are kind of appealing. And so if you look at the literature on propaganda throughout the 20th century, one of the biggest victories for propagandists was making us think that it's only the gullible and the silly that get caught out by propaganda, when in fact the best propagandist can fool all of us. So I think having, taking the hubris out of this can be helpful. And, when talking to people, not kind of making it sound like this is something that all of us face and we're all in it together. The other thing too is sometimes where there's a particular kind of conspiracy theory or narrative that's going around that's wrong, sometimes there is an origin story to that. And if you point to the origin story and which powerful actor or powerful interest group created this story initially, and this won't apply always, but sometimes it does, that could be an effective way of kind of pricking that bubble, because it shows that it's not just some, grand new truth. It's actually something that a pretty nefarious actors put out there. So the Bill Gates 5G COVID thing is a good one on this. So Bill Gates conspiracy theories have been around since the 80s. And it was actually this weird marriage of the kind of the conservative right, who wanted to kind of show that Bill Gates was a eugenicist, who wanted to promote contraception. And so the far right actually tapped into that and kind of said, oh, Bill Gates is a racist who wants to kind of prevent African women from having babies. He's a eugenicist and a racist. So there's this weird marriage between the anti-vax origin story, the far right, the anti-abortion crew, who created these kind of memes about Bill Gates that have now been revived, 15, 20 years later. To me, that's a really powerful one, because it shows that, it's not just some smart person who's figured out the conspiracy. It's actually a really pernicious thing that has been brewing for a long time, and a lot of pretty powerful moneyed interests stand to gain from this narrative continuing.
Yeah. Now we've got a text from Tim, who's listening on the Gold Coast. Hello from non-sunny, well, sunny, but very cool Canberra. Tim, and he asks, what is frightening is that the technology needed to create all this isn't $1 million stuff, it's everyday software. So did you have any, it's more a comment than a question, but Catherine and Hannah, did you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So you're right, it isn't $1 million software. Just like, as is the nature of software, something may be incredibly expensive to develop, but then because of the way that the free market works, eventually it gets to the point where you have free trials, you have that software that is now readily available for the average Joe to be able to download, and it's really user-friendly. So some of the more sort of complex ones that I've seen, sure, I can build my own AI to be able to, create a perfect rendition of Catherine's face and voice and get her to dance like Bruno Mars. There's no point in me actually reinventing the wheel, because there is some code online that I can download that has a really nice platform where I can simply upload a couple of videos of Katherine and get it to do it for me, because someone's done all of that hard yard. And that's because it sources all of this really hard work from everybody else in the community who is desperately trying to be super helpful and groundbreaking at the same time. And so you have, apps on the App Store that are really easy to use and download. What some of you may have noticed is the description for this actual webinar was a deep fake. So I produced it via a website, and it spoke, quite well about deepfakes. And the image of the lady on the flyer that was the sign-up sheet for this webinar, she was a deepfake. And that took me maybe 5 minutes to create. And that was not using any technical skill that I have. It was literally going to a website and clicking refresh.
Katherine?
Yeah, I'd just say this is part of a broader trend too. It's not just deepfakes and it's not just software. A lot of the security threats that are emerging at the moment, and technology-based security threats, are democratized. They're very easily accessible. So if you think about something like drone technology, we talk about that in terms of being a security risk. I can also pop over to Kmart and buy a pretty sophisticated drone. Additive 3D printing. There's concerns there because, particularly as that technology becomes cheaper and more ubiquitous, you can print toys for your kids. You can also print a handgun. And so we're seeing a trend of, many senses, states are no longer have that pure monopoly on the dark arts of espionage and violence. Individuals and citizens and corporations are increasingly playing a role here as well. But that isn't to say we should just kind of throw up our hands and, the end of the world is coming. I think there are still a lot of ways in which we can use laws, norms, the economy to actually control some of this stuff. And just because it is possible for people to access and buy this technology, you can download an app online, doesn't mean that there's not ways to regulate that in some way, and also to create both security measures but also resilience measures so that all of us know how to combat these new and emerging threats.
So just on the laws and norms, I mean, what do we need to be pursuing in that area? Perhaps from a multilateral perspective, from a bilateral perspective, and also here in Australia.
Do you want to start, Hannah? Or?
I'm actually leave this one to you, Katherine.
Oh, thanks. I love me a norm or a law. I think there are a couple of things here. So one, we talk a lot about the big digital platforms of Facebooks and Googles of the world. They are doing more to combat the disinformation and misinformation threat, and they can always do more. So one proposal out there, which I think has a lot of merit, is labeling content if it is known to be created artificially and it's a deep fake. That should be labeled. That helps feed into what Hannah's talking about, this notion of context, so that you can then make an assessment once you know that it's not true, what meaning that content has to you. There are less good proposals out there that say we should, for instance, ban deepfake technology, which one is impossible because of the reasons we've discussed. It's a widely available technology. And two, a lot of the benefits and the things that are driving it are not bad actors. They're people who are trying to do good things and advance science. And frankly, you can never ban science. It's kind of like saying, well, we can no longer do combustion. It's just outlawed. Well, combustion is still going to happen. So we shouldn't ban content. And I'm not even in favour of automatic takedowns of deep fake content online, because, as I said, there could be some pretty legitimate reasons, artistic expression, political expression. We already use CGI or, basic animation in political ads, even, for instance, and we don't think that's a bad thing. But I think having that transparency is important. The other law and norm space, I would say, is actually we should ensure that we have a robust and protected media. So one thing that we haven't really touched on yet, again, in kind of talking about COVID trends, is the hit that public interest journalism in Australia has taken over, the last couple of years, but particularly as a result of the economic fallout of COVID. So the Australian Consumer and Competition Commission, the ACCC, had a landmark report out last year on the impact of the digital world on traditional media. And the conclusion of that body, which is hardly an activist body, was that the business model for public interest journalism in Australia doesn't exist anymore. It's no longer viable. So there's a serious case of market failure here that I think we as a community need to think about how we will address that. Because it's often those independent channels of trusted information, be that the ABC or be that commercial providers, who can cut through the morass of fake news and disinformation and provide trusted information that we can rely on, regardless of all of the other trends of nastiness in the world.
Hannah, did you have anything to add to that?
I think I'll just add one thing in that. First of all, I think Catherine's definitely right in that you don't want to ban the technology, because the technology in itself it's not inherently evil. In fact, it's not even inherently bad. One of the first things you sort of learn when you study cybersecurity is that technology is neither good nor bad nor neutral. It's a reflection of society and will be used as a reflection of society. And it has some really important uses. So you still want to be able to have all of these really important uses for deepfake technology, like the medical breakthroughs that you can use, like the, being able to stop poachers, which is one really cool example of using deepfakes. But then at the same time, you want to be able to protect society and protect those who are vulnerable, who are being taken advantage of by deepfakes. And so this sort of leads you to, well, how can you legislate against it to protect society? Because deepfake is often used as a value add for many nefarious purposes, sometimes a lot of the things that it's being used for are actually already caught up in laws and norms. And so things like child exploitation material that deepfakes are used for, regular human exploitation material, they're all caught up in laws already. If it's used for defamation, Australia already has very stringent defamation laws. If people are concerned about it being used in courts of law to be able to provide, false digital evidence, Australia also has very stringent digital chain of custody regulations. And so on a number of fronts where you see deepfakes being used as this value add to make something more convincing, you already have some of the groundwork for legislation to be able to protect society against it. I think the flip side of that is that international norms are really hard to get people to actually agree to and then actually play by those rules. Essentially, it's this sort of code of conduct that everyone nods their head at and then continues to do their own thing. So, on that front, I think it'd be very difficult to get an international norm, around deepfakes, let alone disinformation.
And I'm just conscious of time. We've just got a text in from Sam who says, the sad thing is that people don't care as much about the truth. You see it in social media every day. And we'll finish on this question. And just for the two of you, if you can just sort of come up with one or two takeaways for the audience today in terms of what they can do in terms of responding to this environment of deepfake technology. You've given some tips to Valerie, but the deepfake, another symptom of a general and creeping disregard for truth and authenticity in society, e.g. disregard of scientific facts. So it gets back to that trust piece that you were mentioning before. So thanks, Michael, for that question. Does the panel think that it is a symptom of the lack of truth and disregard for truth and most importantly, scientific fact? So if you can just briefly comment on that and then wrap up with one or 2 points on what you'd like the takeaway to be for everyone listening today or watching today.
I might jump in first if that's all right.
Yeah.
I actually think it's the opposite. I think that it is not because people have a disregard for the truth. I think people have this incredible hunger for the truth lately, which is why you see conspiracy theories going gangbusters, because people are trying to have these sense-making activities of a world that is arguably pretty chaotic at the moment. And so what that means for deepfakes is that it's about equipping people with the ability to correctly sense make in their activities. It's about being able to give people the ability to read things in context, to be able to give people those cues online in social media to recognize when an account is known for spreading disinformation. Because a lot of the time we're sort of in this interesting space in the internet where we have this small amount of knowledge that can be basically create an echo chamber around us, where all we're hearing is our own opinions echoed back at us, which then supports those opinions and gets more and more extreme. So it's about being able to give people tools that are supported by both government, industry, and obviously the social media platforms, to be able to break the echo chambers so that people can determine what is true, what is real, what is not, and then where to go from there. And then I suppose, you know, as a key takeaway, I think, as Katherine said, people and like the general public are really important in democracies. You know, it is the opinion of the general public, that consistent and considered opinion of the general public, that eventually forms, you know, norms and laws and will shape our society. And so involving the public in discourses about deepfakes, being able to give them tools to differentiate whether something is real or not, and then also being able to sort of help protect those who are more vulnerable online, are all really important things to be able to help us support the good uses of deepfakes and protect those who are vulnerable against the bad uses of deepfakes.
Katherine?
Yeah, I agree with Hannah very much on this. I think that the advent of, or the uptick in conspiracy theories is not to do with the fact that people don't care about the truth. I think it's that people really do care, and they're, you know, people who believe anti-vax conspiracy theories might be wrong and they might be causing public health problems, but why are they susceptible to those views? It's because they care about their families and they care about understanding what they think is the truth. So I think we need to understand that truth making is a very normal human activity, and the psychological and cognitive research that has emerged in the last 20 to 25 years or so shows that when we have situations of complexity, and our world is increasingly complex, technology, social factors, geopolitical factors, and situations of uncertainty, unprecedented times like COVID, certainly unprecedented in living memory, that is the perfect time for people to be searching for meaning and looking for those compelling narratives that can pull cause and effect out of what may be a chaotic situation where pure cause and effect is actually not that easy to find. I think having that understanding, then also thinking about how we as agents in civil society or government people, politicians, whomever, can create those compelling narratives and compelling stories that pull that chaos or that certainty out of chaos in ways that mean things to people. So not dismissing what they're searching for or what they're after, but providing and feeding that appetite, I think, is the meta message here. And the final thing I'd say, drawing that together, and also as a kind of concluding comment, is we need to not just generate awareness that these technologies exist and that they can be used for purposes of evil. And I know my apartment doesn't have curtains, so I'm kind of modelling in my light here the jester-like qualities of light and evil. So sorry about that. But what we should be also doing is generating awareness.
That's the half-truth, half-fake side.
Oh, yes, exactly.
That's right.
Yes.
We should be generating awareness that there are nefarious actors out there who do pollute our information ecosystem to serve their own ends. And I think for many of us, and indeed before I became a researcher in this place, you can have kind of an optimistic idea that, you know, if you go out into the public square, that you are hearing always authentic views, that the prevalence with which something is repeated is an indication of how many people support it. That doesn't exist anymore. And as I said before, there are powerful actors, states, non-states, you know, financially motivated group, extremist ideology groups who have an interest in polluting our information. So developing an awareness of that can actually empower us as well to answer those questions that Hannah emphasised, which is, who's saying this? What do they stand to gain from it? And what's the context? And what's their purpose? And am I being taken for a ride? And humans, as much as we like to pull order from chaos, and we have those kind of biases, we also don't like being taken for a ride. We don't like to think that we're a pawn in someone else's game. And if we can bring a bit more awareness to the ways in which we can be, I think that's a pretty important way of pushing back against some of this stuff.
Great. Thanks, Katherine. And Hannah, it's a rally for empowerment and for slowing down too, Hannah. So we'll finish up there, Michael. Thanks again to Hannah and Katherine for today, and over to you.
What an erudite and fascinating panel. Thank you so much. You know, I actually, listening to you, I'm reminded of what I felt when I walked out of watching the movie The Matrix for the first time, where you question everything. You touch a lamppost and you question it. But I mean, because it might not be real, but that's almost what we're, that almost seems to be what we're facing now. Goodness me. Thank you so much to our panel, co-authors of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's groundbreaking report on deepfakes, Hannah Smith and Katherine Mansted, chaired by Gai Brodtmann, or at least that's who I think we've been talking to. Perhaps this has been completely generated from scratch and you're not actually real. Can I just ask Hannah, Katherine and Gai, is that report available for people to read further online, or is it classified or
No. It's on the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's website. So just type in weaponised deepfake technology. And it was released, 2 months ago? It's a recent report.
Great, thank you. Yeah. Well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners would love to follow up. Hannah, Katherine and Gai, thank you so much. What a fascinating panel discussion we've had. Thanks so much for being part of the Yarra Valley Writers Festival.
Thank you. It's been terrific. Thanks for having us.
Okay, next couple of weeks actually, on the 24th of June, we have our book club. Next, featuring this wonderful tome, Mammoth, which is doing a huge all around the country. It's presented by an extinct mammoth, is the voice that we're following. Chris, a 30,000-year-old extinct animal. It's a wonderful book on conservation and where we are in the world now, as Hannah, Katherine and Gai have been also discussing this afternoon. This is going to be up. I've just been texted. We will be able to share today's discussion on YouTube later today, and also the report, I'm told. Thank you so much for being part of it. Have a lovely day, and farewell once again from the Yarra Valley Writers Festival.